A few instructions for the audience. Request all the participants in the Zoom meeting to keep their mic on mute through the lecture for the smooth conduct of the event. Kindly post your questions in the chat box, which will be taken up by the moderators during the interactive session. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello, sir.
Hi, ma'am. 1 second.
It is working. Hello, can you see me and hear me?
So we can hear you. Yeah.
Now we can hear and see you. Thank you.
Is the framing all right? Do you want me to move backwards or forwards or sideways or zoom or lower the camera? Anything?
It's perfect, sir.
Perfect.
Okay, then I'm all set whenever you like.
Shall begin right away.
Okay, great.
Distinguished Chief Guest of the Day, Honorable MP Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Principal Dr. Tara K. Simon, Manager of UC College, Reverend Thomas John, members of the OSA, retired teachers, alumni, faculty members from various departments, students, and our well-wishers who have joined us virtually from across the globe. Good evening to one and all. The Centenary Public Lecture Series is part of the centenary celebration of Union Christian College, Alua, to address and deliberate on matters of contemporary, social, economic, and political relevance. To inaugurate the lecture series, we have with us today a speaker nonpareil who has left indelible mark in multiple arenas of public life, both nationally and globally. To formally welcome our chief guest and members in the audience, let me invite our principal, Dr. Tara K. Simon. Ma'am.
Honorable guest of the day, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Manager, Reverend Professor T. Thomas John, esteemed friends, colleagues, and my dear students. Founded in faith, Union Christian College, Alua is known for its indigenous origin, secular and democratic approach, simple living, and commitment to society while imparting wholesome education. Whether Indian democracy is at crossroads is a frequently asked question. To speak on this matter, we have with us an eminent figure, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, a phlegmatic statesman in Indian politics, noted for his ability to rise above his political affiliations and speak his mind on urgent issues. We are honored to have Dr. Tharoor inaugurate the Centenary Public Lecture Series and share his thoughts on the future of Indian democracy. Thank you very much, sir, for being with us today. Welcome, one and all. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. It is indeed a great honor and privilege to introduce the eminent speaker of the day, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Dr. Tharoor is a former diplomat, a renowned author of both fiction and non-fiction, a dynamic statesman, and above all, a speaker who inspires awe and admiration with his astounding linguistic prowess and eloquence. That he straddles all these multifarious roles with great panache and exudes amazing cheerfulness and poise in the ebb and flow of national politics makes him truly a man of all seasons. While one could speak eloquent about Dr. Tharoor's staggering accomplishments, given the limited time we have, it would be unfair on my part to come between the speaker and the audience who are eagerly waiting to listen to him. Dr. Tharoor will speak to us today on the topic, Nationalism, Pluralism, and the Future of Indian Democracy. The talk will be followed by an interactive session with students and other members in the audience. The interaction will be moderated by Dr. Sunil Abraham Thomas, Assistant Professor from the Department of Economics, and Dr. Jenny Peter, Assistant Professor from the Department of History. May I now welcome Dr. Tharoor for his address. Sir.
Thank you very much, Shakila. Principal Tara K. Simon, Manager Thomas John, members of the faculty and administration, students, alumni, friends. I hope that covers everyone. Namaskaram to everyone, and it's a pleasure to join you today at the invitation of the UC College, Alua, to inaugurate your Centenary Lecture Series. Lecture Series is perhaps not as well served as it should be by me because I make too many speeches already, all of which you can find on YouTube. So I thought it would be better not to lecture you for the whole time available, but rather to share my brief thoughts on what the future holds for India, and then to interact with you by responding to the questions on your mind. Our nation now finds itself at a significant crossroads, where decisions are being made every single day that have serious and great ramifications for her people, and where we are increasingly seeing a fundamental contestation between two very different ideas of India itself. Some of these momentous events are undoubtedly domestic in their origin, but there's certainly a strong congruence between recent alarming developments in India and global trends, particularly the rise of a populist ethnocentric brand of identity-based nationalism across many of our societies. As I'm sure all of us recognize across the world, questions are being asked about the future of nationalism, the viability of the idea of the nation, and the survival of the nation state. As identity-based ethnic nationalism reasserts itself in the third decade of the 21st century, can it afford to revert to the old models of the 20th? As the post-coronavirus world seems to be retreating behind protective and protectionist barriers, are we witnessing a revival of nationalism and primordial identities? If so, will the characteristics of nationalism be reaffirmed or changed, and in what way? If not, are there alternatives to the civic nationalism that, in my view, and as I've explained in my book, The Battle of Belonging, seem to represent the direction of the modern nation state? And either way, where will and should India go? In our India, the BJP government, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, animated by its fervor for a chauvinistic and distorted militarized version of Hinduism, now referred to as Hindutva, appears determined to promote its version of ethnic nationalism, the Hindu Rashtra concept. In their project to redefine the understanding of nationalism that I have explicated in my own writings, three principal motives have emerged that affect the future of India. First, to establish a shared myth of common Hindu identity for Indian nationhood, derived from a common ancestry, justified by rewriting Indian history, promoting new national slogans like Bharat Mata Ki Jai, introducing a religious test for citizenship through the Citizenship Amendment Act, building a Ram Mandir at Ayodhya, and all of those. Second, to entrench its conception of majoritarian nationalism through such devices as the signaling, even in official speeches, of soft bigotry against minorities, the use of mob violence and riots targeting Muslims, so-called cow vigilantism, the criminalization of triple talaq, and the assault on the autonomy of Jammu and Kashmir and the disposal of Article 370. And third, to secure Hindu Rashtra and Hindu ethnic nationalism through effective centralization and top-down unitary rule by a strongman leader. This has entailed the promotion of Moditva and a personality cult around the Prime Minister, the remaking of the national ethos through what I'm sometimes tempted to dub the Modification of India, the subversion of India's institutions and their subordination to the ruling party's agenda, and the weakening of federalism and its practices by ensuring that financial resources and political clout shift irretrievably towards the Hindi heartland of northern India. The Constitution of India established shared norms on which self-government rests, in particular the statutory equality of every citizen, irrespective of religion, region, or language. India's civic nationalism is both created by and reflected in its provisions. The Constitution granted representation not to an Indian's predetermined identity, religion or caste or language or place of birth, but to each individual's expression of agency as a citizen of India. The governments the Constitution creates are supposed to be committed to the welfare of the country's weakest citizens, including its poor, its low caste, its minorities. Though poverty, social discrimination, and caste tyranny still persist, the Constitution offers the victims protection and redress. Amid the myriad problems of India, it is constitutional democracy that has given Indians of every imaginable caste, creed, culture, and cause the chance to break free of their lot. This rests on a core assumption of civic nationalism, the development and strengthening of free institutions that ensure pluralism, protect diversity, and guarantee the integrity of the state. India's liberal, inclusive, and just constitution, based unambiguously on the principles of civic nationalism, has been the bedrock of our society, a guiding document that historically secured the inalienable right of all Indians. It has not only consolidated and distilled the best of our democratic values, ideas for which our forefathers gave their lives at the height of our national struggle, but has served to liberate the collective aspirations of our people. But as Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the architect, the principal draftsman of our Constitution, presciently warned, a Constitution is only as good as those who are entrusted to work it. That is where, sadly, India seems today to be falling short of the ideals it enshrines. The alternative Hindu nationalist vision of the Bharatiya Janata Party has fundamentally threatened the assumptions of India's constitutional civic nationalism. Its return to power at the helm of government in 2019 and the breathtaking speed with which it has subsequently introduced and cleared far-reaching legislation, such as, of course, the RTI Amendment Act to gut the independence of the Right to Information Commissioners, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act to assume sweeping powers of arrest and detention and to declare any individual as a terrorist, and the abrogation of Article 370, which had guaranteed autonomy to the state of Jammu and Kashmir, and of course the Citizenship Amendment Act, which for the first time introduced a religious test for Indian citizenship. By fast-tracking citizenship for refugees from neighboring countries, provided they are not Muslim, all these pose a fundamental threat to the future of the freedoms that we have taken for granted, every one of them grounded in the tenets of India's civic nationalism since our independence from colonial rule in 1947. Far more worrying, however, is the remarkable shift in pace in the ruling party's ambition from their first innings to their second. They've gone from whispering about changing the constitution to openly undermining it, from suggesting that some Indians are first and others are last, to enacting such an idea in the CAA, to openly ensuring that from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, the very experience of Indianness and what it means to be an Indian is different, and from asserting control over independent national institutions to openly using them as instruments of their political agenda. All of this makes it abundantly clear that the present ruling dispensation is remaking the country into a populist, communalist, chauvinist, authoritarian, slickly marketed and power-hungry kakistocracy supported by stoked-up vigilante mobs, all in the name of a democratically elected government and at the expense of those public institutions that were intended to safeguard the rights of all Indians. They do in the name of what the Prime Minister has dubbed New India. In the old India, fought for by the blood of our forefathers and birthed in the crucible of our national struggle, the fundamental premise that was ultimately forged was that of access to a historically inalienable set of freedoms, the freedom of choice being prime, the freedom to choose what government you wanted, the freedom to choose what set of convictions you wanted to resonate with, the freedom to choose who to love and how to love, the freedom to choose what to wear, to eat, to drink, to speak, the freedom to move freely within the sovereign borders of the Republic, and the freedom to choose whether Ram or Rahim or Jesus or Jehovah was the force that guided and moved the cosmos. All of these were freedoms enshrined in our Constitution and embedded not just in the letter and the spirit of the law, but in the lived experience of India and its peoples. In its place, an ugly distortion of the Indian idea is rising. An India where an especially dangerous and perverted form of ethno-nationalism is being fostered, and a narrow-minded majoritarianism prevails, where incidents of communal violence proliferate, driven by mob lynching zealots and Gau Rakshak vigilantes. In this grotesque so-called New India, driven by Hindutva zealotry, Bharat Mata Ki Jai and Jai Shri Ram have become rallying cries of bigotry rather than the beautiful slogans that Indians would be free to use or not as they wish. Human beings have been assaulted and killed in the name of cow protection. Muslims and Dalits have been particularly victimized. The father of an Air Force Havildar, a 15-year-old boy returning from Eid shopping, a dairy farmer transporting cows with a permit, Dalits doing their job of skinning a dead cow, have all been casualties of this new India. In fact, as the scholar Pratap Bhanu Mehta fittingly asked, how did this fantasy of hope, painted in the colors of a nation marching to one tune and one purpose, completely blanket out the actual republic of fear? If India is to reclaim its soul, the urgent national challenge is to restore, empower, and renew the very institutions of civic nationalism that the BJP has commanded and weakened. These are the institutions that can best protect the minorities and the marginalized, that protect free speech and the expression of unfashionable opinions, that elevate principles and values above the interests of politicians in power, that offer shelter and aid to the vulnerable, and so create the habits and conventions and make democracy the safest of political systems for ordinary people to live under. This is what true civic nationalism is about, the only nationalism that is actually suited to India. Indians should be speaking of a common future more than of a divided past. In that common sense of purpose would lie the basic premise of our belonging. Like most democratic civic nationalists, I want a new India too. It will be a new India where you won't get lynched for the food you eat, marginalized for the faith you hold dear, criminalized for the person you love, or imprisoned for making use of fundamental rights guaranteed by your own constitution. Instead, we must look forward to a new India that celebrates and welcomes pluralism, an idea vindicated by history itself, and one that is uniquely suited to our country. To me, this new India must be fundamentally rooted in the idea of India that our founding fathers believed in and enshrined in the Constitution. After all, as I've asked in a different context, if you don't know where you're coming from, then how can you know where you are going? The answer for India, how can you appreciate where you are going? The answer for India lies in a reaffirmation of patriotism. Not an empty jingoistic patriotism, certainly not ethnic nationalism masquerading as love of country, but a patriotism of love for your community, your nation, your fellow Indians, of multiple local territorialities, a patriotism that celebrates pluralism. A rampant ethnic nationalism can only propose top-down national solutions to the anxieties of nationhood. Local patriotism, the attachment of the peasant to his land, of the poet to his language, is either sentimentalized or looked down upon. But we live in a world where it's increasingly essential to be both local and national. The response to the COVID pandemic has highlighted the need for a country like India to be simultaneously local and national, as bureaucratic instructions issued from Delhi have proven to be out of touch with the realities in distant states and districts. This was already apparent from the experience of dealing with environmental degradation. The Swachh Bharat campaign could not succeed through press releases from the capital and photo ops of leaders draped in national flags, but only with effective local efforts. The COVID crisis has also made it clear that we cannot fight a pandemic nationally without taking the local along. Central diktats could not prevent the virus from spreading. The migrant crisis showed that Indians are tied emotionally to the places they are from, much more than to the places they live in for the temporary exigencies of work. And the economic crisis brought about by the COVID lockdown needs national solutions, but simultaneously highlights the importance for all Indians to support the local farmer, the corner shopkeeper, the returned migrant, the small business person, the unemployed factory worker, and so on. It is time to reaffirm the idea of India enshrined in our constitution. This requires a conscious effort to defend the besieged institutions of our civic nationalism, to restore their autonomy and ensure their effectiveness, to defend and strengthen our civic nationalism with its unique overlay of everything that's good and valuable about India. We will also need to undertake a careful retelling of a modern Indian history that is comprehensive, embraces all experiences, and refuses to see the past through the prism of any one faith. Swami Vivekananda spoke of the religion professed by the majority in this country, Hinduism, as one that does not merely tolerate other faiths, but accepts them as they are. This acceptance of difference has been key to our country's survival, making unity in diversity the most hallowed of India's self-defining slogans. It is that unity we seek, not uniformity. It is consensus we must pursue, not conformity. Our choice is clear. We can have a new India that belongs to all of us, led by a government that works for all of us. Or we can have a new India that belongs to some and serves the interests of a few. That is the difference between the civic nationalism enshrined in the constitutional republic and the ethno-religious linguistic nationalism of Hindi, Hindutva, Hindustan. The idea of India matters because it's the only idea that can keep India together. It has worked for many decades in addressing the severe problems the British left us with. This idea and the practice of civic nationalism is not just woolly-headed liberal talk, but a practical and hard-headed vision of what India needs to both survive and thrive. A Hindu Rashtra will end up dividing India. A liberal democratic India rooted in civic nationalism, animated by a common purpose and striving for a shared destiny, will unify the nation in an inclusive sense of belonging. India's founding fathers wrote a constitution for their dreams. We have given passports to their ideals. That is the India that Mahatma Gandhi fought to free, and it is well worth preserving in the future. The revival of our beleaguered civic nationalism must be both civic and nationalist. We must remain faithful to our founding values of the 20th century if we are to conquer the looming challenges of the 21st. On this note, I wish UC College a very successful centenary. I thank you all very much, and I look forward to interacting with you as you offer me your questions. Jai Hind. Thank you. Is somebody going to submit the questions, repeat the questions? Yeah, thanks.
Yes, thank you. So thank you, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, for that enlightening and the rare exposition of ideas and thoughts. Now it's time for the most awaited part of the session. As Dr. Shashi Tharoor itself tweeted today, we are going to have a long interaction. And I'm sure that all of us are really excited to interact with our chief guest, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. You can either type your questions in the chat box or in the chat box, and the moderators can read it out for Dr. Shashi Tharoor, or you can raise your hands so that we can call you for raising your questions. Please make sure that you introduce yourself before raising your query, and your question should be brief but precise. Wishing all of you a great time, and I think we can take the first question.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. We share your views of New India. I'm sure the students have been thinking a lot about it, and they would like to interact with you. So as Dr. Sunil said, we look forward to that tweet, a very long interaction indeed.
It won't be that long anymore, but let's see how much we can do in the time available. I have an MP meeting me in about 20 minutes max.
Yeah, yes.
Not keep him waiting. Go on.
Yes, yes. So, dear participants, please be very brief with your questions. You can use the chat box or you can raise your hands. Yes, Ojaswini, yes. Ojaswini, please unmute and ask your question.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening, sir. It is an absolute honor to be able to interact with you today.
Thank you, Yashvi.
Yes, Prabhu. I am currently pursuing my post-graduation in English literature in UC College. So my question to you is, you have been a center of attraction when we think about, shaking the whole nation and bringing up nationalism, mainly because of the Oxford speech that you gave. And I remember that you wrote in your book, An Era of Darkness, that you were pleasantly surprised and also a bit perplexed with the reaction that you got. What I would like to know is, what do you think is different between the nationalism of India and the nationalism of other countries, if there are any?
Oh, well, you can't generalize. There are 192, 193 countries in the United Nations. So each one of them has its own history, its own story, and why it's nationalist and how its nationalism has been shaped. I would say that if we were to classify very broadly, as I've done in my book, The Battle of Belonging, I would divide it broadly into two kinds of nationalisms. One is nationalism emerging from identity. It may be religion, maybe language, maybe ethnicity, it may be even sort of geography. And there are all these kinds of nationalisms that I've anatomized in my book. And then the other kind of nationalism is what is called civic nationalism, which has nothing to do with the accident of your birth into a particular identity, but is a nationalism that resides in constitutions and institutions. So if you were to typify the nationalisms of the entire world, I would say these are the two broad categories. The identity category varies enormously. So, many countries are also evolving. You've got people countries in Europe that were once identifiably defined by a single color of skin, a single language, a single territory, and a single history. And today, they themselves have become more and more melting pots of immigrants and so on. So changes are happening around the world. But broadly, the evolution from a nationalism based on immutable features of identity into institutional, constitutional kind of nationalism has been a trend in the last half century or so that I hope is not reversed by the backlash we are seeing with the rise of a Donald Trump or a Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey or people like that who are trying to reassert, like Mr. Modi in India, a much more identity-based nationalism in their countries. Thank you, Ajasvi.
Yeah. Thank you. I think Irene has posted in the chat box. She has a question on Hindutva. Please unmute and ask. Irene.
Yeah, thank you. I am. Yeah, thank you. Hi, sir. Myself, Irene Mariamani, second year B economics student of UC College, Alabama. Sir, today we are more familiar with the rise of Hindutva in India. So, do you consider it as an ideology, distortion of peace among Hindu religion? Also, today the idea of India is criticized by all sorts of forces, as you have already mentioned now. So the forces of intolerance, bigotry, and even questioning the protection of cow versus protection of human beings. So my question to you is that, who sets these priorities? And do we have to accept this? What do you think, sir? Thank you.
It's a good question, but a difficult one to answer. Who sets our priorities? In a democracy, our country consists of voters. The people set the priorities. But if indeed the voters are essentially dragooned into supporting a particular kind of nationalistic choice through a combination, as I mentioned, of very slick marketing, effective propaganda, an overwhelmingly dominant government, and of course election results that would give you the kind of results that they seek, then in that case, I'm afraid the people's choice may very well get distorted. The system you follow also has an impact. In a presidential system, the winner has to win 50.1, whereas in our system, the BJP has won 2 successive elections with 31% and 37% of the vote, but the majority on the other side that does not agree with their agenda is divided in multiple ways. There are 37 parties in the Lok Sabha today. So inevitably, when you say who decides or who sets the priorities, the winner in this process will set the priorities, and that is unfortunately, from my point of view anyway, the party of Hindutva nationalism, which is the BJP. Thank you, Irene.
Yeah.
Thank you, Shashi Tharoor. And we have another question from Rashad. Rashad, you have raised your hands. Can you post your question?
You're not unmuted yet.
You please unmute.
Yeah, am I audible now?
Yes.
Okay. So this question comes from one of my students. His name is A.B. Thomas.
I think he's having some network issue over there.
So he asked you, how does the future of our country look like with the current? Yeah, am I audible, sir?
Yeah. Please carry on.
Hello. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. So this question is asked by one of my students, A.B. Thomas, and he says, how does the future of our country look like with the current education system in place, and what changes should be made immediately to our education system?
Well, you know, the new education policy is surprisingly liberal in conception. A lot will depend on implementation. The new education policy announced by the government, and I say announced because there's been no real genuine discussion in Parliament, is one which will in fact increase the choices available at the school level, particularly permitting a combination of science and humanities at all levels. It will in fact also multiply the options for university autonomy, which is certainly a better way of promoting excellence than a one-size-fits-all kind of approach from the UGC, as has traditionally been the case. And I will say to you frankly that our system, in my view, particularly of higher education, is currently over-regulated and under-governed. And a policy that takes it more in the direction of reducing regulation, but focusing on accreditation and learning outcomes, examination results, and so on, that would definitely, in my view, be an improvement on the way in which our education policy has been conceived so far. So I actually have, I know it surprises many who know that I was very wary of the BJP government's intentions in producing a new education policy. I've largely supported it with one caveat, that the challenge we have is that the education policy does seem to rely a great deal on the private sector, and there is a risk, therefore, of quality education becoming unaffordable to ordinary students from ordinary families around the country who are not of considerable means, if everything gets much more expensive than before. That is the only issue, and I will say that to my mind at this stage, a lot, I mean, as the old cliche goes, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The policy and its success will depend very much on its implementation. And if a narrow-minded government tries to implement it in a particular way, then of course it may be a different story. But at the moment, at least in concept and theory, it seems broadly a welcome education policy with no emphasis on saffronization, as many of us were afraid, and with a genuinely liberal orientation of enhancing choice and opportunity for students at all levels. Now let's hope it works in practice. Thank you, Rashad.
Yeah, thank you. I think let's move to Srija Nair, faculty in history.
Hello. Hello, sir. Good evening.
Hello, Srija.
Hello, sir. I'm Srija. I work with UCC College, as mentioned by Matt. A faculty in history. Actually, as usual, your talk is brilliant and insightful. I have this question, sir. You said that democracy is the safest system. And also, democracy is all about the majority. When the majority have this fundamentalist tinge and have no belief in the founding principles, especially seeing the recent electoral trend in UP, Goa, and all, can democracy safeguard the aspirations of minorities anymore? actually it is already losing its characters of tolerance, accommodation, and liberal values. So do you think is there any better alternative for democracy, or the only option is the system of democracy should evolve for better?
Well, thank you, Srija, for that. First of all, I would say it's not the majority that has these majoritarian views and attitudes. It is the political majority as constituted by the results of a first past the post election system. And that political majority is not, I believe, a numerical majority. I think a lot of psephologists have done detailed studies of electoral voting patterns. And for the most part, very few cases have been found where in a state or an area, and certainly not nationally, where the party of Hindutva, namely the BJP, has actually won a majority of Hindu votes. They are essentially being able to construct their crushing majorities on two features, namely half the Hindu votes, roughly, sometimes slightly less than half, and a divided opposition. Now, you ask me, are we condemned to the system? Obviously, this is the system enshrined in our constitution. Dr. Ambedkar himself was much more inclined to pursue a presidential system. And I have argued in my various writings, which you're welcome to Google and see, that I believe a presidential system, which I don't just mean one elected president in India. I mean directly elected chief executives at all levels, starting from panchayats and town council, town mayors, to state chief ministers or governors, as well as the president or prime minister. Everyone being directly elected by the people would ensure that you have people who actually represent the majority and who at the same time have the ability, which is no small thing, to be able to respond to all interests and all sections of our rather complex and diverse society. However, that would require a wholly new constitutional change. And there is at the moment no appetite for it, because our political class, which would have to bring about such a change, in any case, prefers the system that they know and are familiar with. So we have to work the system we have as best as we can. And in those circumstances, the only answer lies in reducing the fragmentation of opposition votes by creating a more effective index of opposition unity. And that could make a very big difference. That's probably where I'd leave it, Srija. I only have time for another 2 questions, so I better be brief.
Yes, yes. So, is there anybody else? There are a lot of, in fact, many have raised their hands. What about
we'll go with Esni. Esni Elias,
yes.
I think you have a very interesting question. You might have it, please.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Yes, go ahead, Esni.
Yes, Esni Elias.
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So you have talked and taught a lot about Indianism in English language, like the word you coined yourself pre-porn. Interestingly, there are a lot of words that British loaded from India. So my question is, what's the future of Indian English? I'm asking this because we Indians acknowledge the fact that there is something called Indian English exists. Still, we try to imitate Kuhn's proper English while in writing more effectively in pronunciation. I would like to hear your thoughts on this.
Actually, you're right. The English language is famous for actually borrowing from many languages. And I must say that that's to the credit, I think, of the English language, that they've had that kind of talent to borrow from various languages and use them in many ways. Now, for my mind, this is a great strength. There are, of course, obviously Indian expressions like satyagraha, namaste, or yogi that have passed into the Indian language, into the English language, and are used exactly as they're in India. But there are many other words that in the English language in India are used differently from the English language in the West. For example, a habit of calling elders auntie or uncle is never done in the West. Using the expression non-veg to convey our willingness to eat meat is Indian, but it is not used. You can't go to England and say I'm a non-veg, they won't know what you're talking about. If you look at our journalism, we have regular headlines about the chief minister air dash to Delhi. Air dash is an Indian English word, doesn't exist in English in the West. or if a criminal is described as a history sheeter, that is a purely Indian English word. Even some of our slang, I don't know whether, like in my time, certainly a very common word was the word mugging, which meant to cram hard for an examination, mug up a lot, rote learning, memorization. Do you still use that word, Esme, in today's youngsters? Do they say mugging? I'm mugging hard for my exams?
No, sir.
Yeah?
We
No.
might be
Okay,
saying.
so we used to see that, but of course abroad it means something very different. Either a criminal assault by a robber or an elaborate and often comically exaggerated expression like mugging for the camera. But so many of our things are not fully understood, and then the way we use the language, right? Particularly this Indian English habit of saying, kindly adjust. Now, the seventh person is slipping onto a bench meant for four, and he says, kindly adjust, and everyone has sweet. Or you explain some problem in India which others can't understand, and the Indian excuse is, we are like that only. And that's Indian English for you. Thank you, Esli.
Thank you. Thank you. So on that note, let's take the last question from Dr. Verghese John, our former faculty. Would you like to ask, or shall I read it out, sir? The question is, when politics thrives on playing to the emotions of the majority that forms the majority in elections, how do you think the idea of civic nationalism can compete with that?
No, that's a very good point. And in fact, one of the things that I've tried to assert, and I would urge Dr. Verghese to read my book, The Battle of Belonging, is that we can anchor civic nationalism in a genuine idea of patriotism. I tried to hint at that a little bit in my brief remarks. Because to my mind, to be patriotic is to love your country the way you would love your mother. It is not a chauvinistic, aggressive, assertive sort of love. It is simply because you belong to her and she belongs to you, and the same applies to the country. You belong to this country, the country belongs to you, and it's a love of that kind of intimacy, of belonging. That is patriotism to my mind. And that has its local variants, as I mentioned, for your neighborhood, your community, your city, your state, your love for all of that as part of your love for your country. And when you think of India, if you're a Malayali, maybe the images evoked in your mind are very different from, say, a Kashmiri or a Bengali or a Gujarati, but cumulatively they all make up a patriotic love of India. Nationalism of the identity kind essentially says that one set of people are superior to everyone else. The country belongs to them in a way that it doesn't to others, that they have the right to assert their superior status, that they will even, if necessary, attack others to preserve that, whether our neighboring states or others are hostile to us. And what is worrying about this, I wrote in the book, is that while a patriot is prepared to die for his country, a nationalist is prepared to kill for his state. And that is, to my mind, a much less attractive proposition. Civic nationalism is closer to patriotism than to identity-based nationalism. The civic nationalism, because it's anchored in institutions, processes, democracy, constitutional rights, respects the individual's love for his nation and the individual's autonomy as a citizen of the country. Now, I realize that Dr. Verghese is also implying something to which I don't have as good an answer. And that is that when people are appealing to emotions, talking about the flag, about the soil, the blood, etc., then can it compete with civic nationalism? My argument is, if civic nationalism is anchored in the kind of patriotism I've described, then an appeal to the soil of the nation, the fluttering of the flag, the sacrifices of the soldiers, all of that is equally dear to the civic nationalist. But ultimately, the difference comes when the civic nationalist looks at people who are, quote unquote, not people like him or her, and says they have as much right to belong and to claim this soil, this motherland, as I do. And that is where ultimately we have to humanize this through more and more appeals to people to understand the essence, that it's about the kind of normal relations we have with friends who happen to be of different faiths, different castes, different languages. That's what we want to see protected in our country. Let us celebrate and focus on what unites us and not what divides us. That too can be made into an emotional message, I hope. But it's an uphill task. I'm not pretending it's easy. Thank you very much, Dr. Berge. Thank you, Jenny, Peter. Thank you all very much for your patient listening. I want to apologize to the students who are waiting with their hands up, but the MP who was supposed to come for a meeting at 7:45 arrived at 7:30, and I've kept him waiting 15 minutes already. So I really will have to go.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank
So
you all,
we
and
look
good luck
forward
for
to
the
a common
centenary
future.
celebrations. Well, one day I hope to come to Alava and see your college in person. Meanwhile, all the very best to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir. Please do come.
Thank you. Bye.
Agila Miss, please.
Yes. So as we come to the end of the session, let me invite our manager, Reverend Thomas John, for the concluding remarks.
To have a person of the stature of Dr. Shashi Tharoor to inaugurate our Centenary lecture series. He was very successful in weaving nationalism, pluralism, and democracy into the tapestry of the civic nationalism of India. The concept of homogeneous nation state was never part of India's understanding of nationhood. It is not intrinsic to it. Our understanding of nationalism was one of accommodation, tolerance, and assimilation of differences. There is increasing attempts, deliberate attempts to do away with this understanding of nationalism. India's nationalism is not that of a nation state, but rather it is a civilizational concept that represents not just a historical territory, ethno-linguistic group, or body of governance, but a unique civilization in its own right. It is this sort of nationalism that Tagore and for great extent Mahatma Gandhi envisioned. As we celebrate the 70th year of independence, it is imperative that we be concerned about the future of India's democracy. Thank you, Dr. Tharoor, for bringing this message to all of us, enlightening us to the dangers that are lurking behind our nationalistic jingoism and exhorting us to embrace civic nationalism. Thank you. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you, sir, for that valuable remarks. So thank you all for joining us today. Hope you had a wonderful session. With this, we conclude the meeting. Good night.